this is Malachi the Clue. Thank you for reading It's in the Blood. Welcome to Book 2.
Prologue. It was such an innocent mishap, nothing less though. The 12-year-old boy found himself heading headfirst towards an unknown doom. What was that I stumped my toe on? The lad asked himself. At first the 12-year-old couldn't focus his eyes on anything within the darkness. He could only wish that this long moment of slow motion could bring him to a soft landing. As a flashback crossed his mind, he remembered a time that he had fallen off of his bicycle in the rain. Just as it had now, time had instantly slowed down prior to coming to an extremely painful and bloody stop. He remembered how he had wiped the top of his head, with the palm of his hand, finding it to be covered with blood and a clump of flesh with hair still attached to it. He remembered how he had used his other hand to pick himself up off of the ground, by grasping onto the chrome bumper of an old pickup truck, that had caused the bloody mess. Now, as he continued his downward descent, his eyes became focused on a rock that could have been, or might as well have been, the size of the moon. With this another memory flashed through his mind. He remembered how his father, perhaps about 2 years prior to this moment, had showed him, with a telescope, the planet of Saturn. As quick as this memory came to his numb mind, his eyes refocused on the rock below that had now appeared much larger than seconds before. Within his peripheral vision he could now make out lights from a few surrounding houses near the bottom of the nearly 150-foot drop-off, of the sand rocks that had created this soon-to-be life-altering experience. Then, just as he closed his eyes before impact, the 12-year-old found himself to have made a sudden stop within. Opening his eyes, he wondered for a moment, if it was his life just coming to an end, the sudden experience of life after death, or... Though the darkness he couldn't see what had caught him, he could see, however, that something or someone was holding him. Holding him tightly. Holding him close to themselves. As his head was rested against the sternum of someone's chest, he could feel that that person was using their arms to hold him in the fetal position, under his legs and the center of his back. Feeling that he had free motion of his left arm, he raised his hand up over his own head hoping to be able to identify the person holding him. As he did so his fingers followed up his protector's sternum to the base of the person's neck. Just hold on, Eddie. We're almost back to the top of the sand rocks. Malachi? Is that you? The shaken 12-year-old asked. Yes, Eddie. I told you that I could fly. Chapter 1. Well, Malachi, what did you wish for this year? David asked his son just as he blew out the 13 candles. Nicole had been the only friend outside of the immediate family that had been invited to the celebration. This wasn't due to the lack of friends, but rather Malachi's idea that this would make a better personal impression onto Nicole. Looking up from the cake, as his father asked his question, Malachi stared into Nicole's eyes from across the table. My wish is to spend the rest of my life with the person that I love the most. Malachi's voice was extremely stern as he answered his father. With his answer the rest of the family turned and stared at Nicole. I love you, Malachi, Nicole said as a tear ran down her face. I want to spend the rest of my life with you too. With this response everyone paused for a moment and then simultaneously began to clap hands. The fact that Malachi was only 13 years old had weighed pretty hard on David's mind, as his son had repeatedly made insinuations of a long life with Nicole. To remain positive, however, and wishing that his son would grow up happy, he never took any part of arguing against Malachi's wishes. Hey Karina. Mrs. Sanchez spoke up just as the clapping faded away. How about you and I do the dishes together? I need some one-on-one time with you for a little while. The older women said as the rest of the family went out into the backyard. Is everything alright, Mom? Karina asked with a look of worry on her face. Yes, of course, I just need to talk with you. Then suddenly the doorbell rang, interrupting the two women. I'll be right back, Mom. I'll go see who that is, Karina said as she walked out of the kitchen and then down the stairs. As Karina opened the door she looked down into the eyes of a boy about Malachi's age. Pulling his hands out from behind him he held out a present. Ma'am. Is Malachi home? Yeah, he is. What's your name? I don't think that I've met you before. My name is Eddie. I'm in Malachi's class at school. He had told me once, long time ago, that his birthday is on May 24th. I went and bought something for him with my allowance, Eddie continued as he looked up to Karina. Well, that's very thoughtful of you. Come on in, Eddie. The kids are outside in the backyard. You can get to them through the sliding glass door in the kitchen, Karina said as she led the way up the steps. Thank you, ma'am. Eddie finished and then exited the kitchen to the fenced-in yard behind the house. Well, gee. Who was that little polite one? Karina's mom asked as she held her hands on her hips with her back to the sink. He says that his name is Eddie and is friends with Malachi at school. Too bad that our kids aren't that polite. With this, Karina began to fill one of the sinks with hot water as she put dish soap under the faucet stream. You know, Karina. Mrs. Sanchez began as she too turned to face the sink. Now that Malachi has reached his 13th year, there are some additional things that you need to know about him. And then again when Ronnie reaches that age. Turning off the faucet, Karina turned to face her mother with a look of worry on her face. What do you mean by additional things, Mom? It's been hard enough spending the last 13 years hiding the ESB from David. I don't know how much more that I can take on. Reaching out to hold her daughter's arm, Mrs. Sanchez firmly grasped onto Karina as she looked her in the eyes. Karina. You've got to understand and remember that no matter what changes ever take place, now or later, that those boys of yours are your children. Also, as I've told you before, their number one mission in life will be to protect your life. A second mission, for Malachi anyhow, will be to protect Nicole's life. When, and if, Ronnie finds himself a special person in his life, his second mission will be to protect that person. I know. You've told me before about them protecting me. But what other things are gonna happen now? And am I gonna be able to keep these things from David and others that come into our lives? Yes, Karina. If you make a direct effort, with Malachi and Ronnie, to keep things among yourselves, then obviously no one will know. Mrs. Sanchez said as she loosened her grip on Karina's arms. Well, then what else is gonna happen? And how many of their close friends are gonna die as we learn to live with it? Karina's eyes suddenly filled with tears and then one single tear rolled down her cheek as she continued to look at her mother. Reaching back out towards her daughter, Mrs. Sanchez wrapped her arms around Karina to relax her. Honey. Sometimes Malachi and Ronnie are gonna make mistakes. When they do, and it will happen again, you'll need to forget about it. Trying to remember won't fix whatever happened, nor will remembering help you to deal with it when it happens again. Letting go of the hug, Mrs. Sanchez led Karina, by the hand, to the dining room table. Pulling out a chair for her daughter, she then quickly sat down next to her. For a moment neither one of them spoke. They just both sat there as they stared out through the sliding glass door towards the children as they played. Looking back towards her mom, and then wiping away one last tear, Karina cleared her throat as she continued. All right, Mom. What else? Well, really. Beyond the ESB, there are 4 other things that Malachi, now that he has reached his 13th year, will be able to do, one of which is a short list of allergies that could harm him, then possibly even kill him. Pausing for a moment, Karina's mom turned her head back towards the door and looked at the kids as they continued to play. Malachi is gonna start staying out late at night, or, at least staying awake late at night. Looking back towards Karina, she continued. Malachi is gonna start having a severe allergy to the ultraviolet light that the sun produces. This ultraviolet light will severely burn his skin. Holy water. Pausing for just a second. Holy water from a Catholic church will burn his skin along with other tissues under his skin. Then, one last allergy. If anything ever penetrates his heart, regardless of how minor the injury may be, he will die instantly. The other allergies may also kill him if he is not taken out of direct contact with them as quickly as possible. Are those all of the allergies? Karina asked in a soft, quiet tone of voice. Yes. With this answer, Mrs. Sanchez looked up to the kitchen counter towards the coffee maker. Would you like a cup of coffee, honey? I'm gonna pour myself some. Getting up from the table, she walked over to the cupboard above the coffee maker. Yes, please, Mom, Karina said as she turned in her chair to where she could look directly at her mom. What other changes are there gonna be? Well, Mrs. Sanchez started as she pulled out 2 cups. Along with the enlarged canines, Malachi's body has now produced venom that will be secreted through the bite from the canines. The holes in the roof of the ear-mouth, at the 13th year, have now grown glands in the upper plate of their mouths. You can't see these glands because the upper plate hides them and protects them. With this venom, when and if Malachi bites someone, that person will then also become a vampire. The only exception is if Malachi were to instantly drain that person of all of his or her blood, killing them. This venom is a pathogenic microorganism that permanently contaminates the victim's blood. The effects are not reversible, unless Malachi were to remove all of that person's blood. Sitting back down at the table, Mrs. Sanchez handed Karina one of the cups of coffee. One last change, or addition, is that Malachi will be able to some extent, fly, hover, or levitate. It is this one that you'll need to worry about David finding out. How are we gonna know when this ability, or the others, are able to be done by Malachi? Karina asked as she carefully sipped from her hot cup of coffee. Malachi will know first. Most likely by accident. Also, most likely he'll find out before the end of today. The experience will most likely scare him at first, and hopefully nobody will see it when it happens. Karina, you need to make sure that he keeps his teeth off of people. The last thing that we need is an outbreak of vampires in today's society. Standing up from her seat, Mrs. Sanchez slowly walked up to the sliding glass door and watched as the children kicked a soccer ball around the yard. Karina. She started again and then suddenly paused. You need to remember that our survival is within the silence. We cannot allow anyone to know. I understand this, Mom. But what if Malachi, or Ronnie after his 13th year, accidentally bites someone? What do we do about keeping silent then? Karina asked as she also stood then watched out the sheet of glass with her mother. In that case, turning to face her daughter, a choice has to be made immediately on rather to allow that person to die or become one of us. If we feel that our existence is at risk through an individual person, then it is up to us to terminate that person's life. Mom. I am a police officer of the Craig Police Department, how am I gonna? Karina. Mrs. Sanchez snapped loudly. You are a vampire. Who you are biologically comes before your choice of employment. Pointing out the window, as Ronnie sat on a step petting Spud, she continued. Those are your children, Karina. They love you very much, just as you love them. Those children of yours are predestined to risk their own lives to protect yours. Now, what are you willing to do to protect theirs? What are you willing to do to protect our lives? Raising her hand, Karina wiped away a tear as her eyes had, once again, become wet. You're right. I will do anything to protect the lives of my children. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to kill. Only if we doubt that person's ability to remain quiet. Mrs. Sanchez finished and then reached out to her to catch another tear for her. It's gonna be all right, honey. Give me a hug. Come on, Ronnie. Leave the dog alone and come play with us. Please. Malachi pressed. Ronnie was playing but then felt as though his mom and grandmother were talking about them. He had strongly felt that the conversation between them had to do with additional powers, or abilities, associated with their 13th birthdays. Through the loud yelling and playing between his brother, Nicole, and Eddie, Ronnie had missed parts of the conversation. All right. I'm coming. Ronnie announced as he stood up and then walked away from the dog. Then, as Ronnie got about 10 feet away from the porch, Spud quickly raced to Ronnie's side and grabbed a hold of his pant leg. I'm surprised how much energy that dog has. Nicole commented. Spud is at least 12 years old now. What kind of dog is it? Eddie asked as he bent over to pick up the soccer ball. A Chinese pug. Malachi piped up as he grabbed Eddie from behind. Then, as he wrapped one arm around Eddie's chest, he quickly used his other arm to pull his head backwards. With this hold, Malachi, acting as though he was gonna bite his friend, placed his mouth around Eddie's neck and carefully dragged his teeth over Eddie's jugular vein. Careful there, Malachi. I'm not a pincushion, you know, Eddie said jokingly as he had also pulled his head forward. As he did this, he suddenly felt a stinging sensation as Malachi's teeth sunk into the soft tissues of Eddie's neck. Ouch. Ooh. I'm sorry, Eddie. Malachi quickly said as he pulled himself away from his friend. I didn't mean to do that. Eddie placed one hand over the side of his neck as he used the other to hold onto his stomach. Malachi. It feels like it's burning. And I'm feeling dizzy. Alright. Let's go into the garage, Eddie. And Nicole, you and Ronnie don't say anything about what just happened, just keep playing like everything is normal, Malachi said quietly enough that nobody would hear inside the house. Then, turning back towards his friend, he led Eddie, by the arm, towards the back door of the garage. Just as they entered the door, Malachi suddenly felt as though he was carrying perhaps the majority of his friend's body weight. Eddie. Can you get up on here? As he asked, he patted his free hand on the door of the icebox. Looking up towards Malachi's face, Eddie tried his best to focus his eyes on Malachi's facial features. With the best of his efforts, however, the only improvement was going from quadruple vision to double vision. And blurred at that. I don't think so. I can't even move without you personally moving me. Eddie answered. Listening to his friend's slurred response, Malachi quickly decided that he would have to lift his friend onto the freezer. Okay, Eddie. I want you to rest against the side of the freezer while I lift you from behind your knees with one arm, and then behind your shoulder blades with my other arm. Now, as I place my arm on the back of your legs, I want you to let your body weight down onto my arm so that I can lift you. Alright? Are you sure that you can, Malachi? You're not much bigger than I am. Though Eddie had fully doubted Malachi's physical ability to do exactly what he had just described, the weakness throughout his body was almost immediately reluctant to follow Malachi's directions. As Eddie's knees almost buckled at Malachi's request, Malachi was extremely surprised at just how light his friend was. Almost as if his friend weighed nothing at all. Then, as Malachi began to straighten his legs, from his slightly knelt-down position, with his friend within his arms, he suddenly found himself floating off of the cement floor. What the hell? Malachi cried out loud. With his friend still and his arms unconscious, Malachi was in total awe as he looked at the floor that was about 4 feet below the level of his feet. Tightening his grip onto his friend, Malachi looked all around himself to find a simple explanation for what was happening. Then, as he adjusted his eyes on the top of the freezer, he realized that he was in perfect elevation to place Eddie's body on the freezer's door. Extending his arms, and finding that his friend was still weightless, Malachi carefully placed Eddie on the icebox. Pulling his arms back, he instantly began to lower to the floor, once again without effort. As his feet touched the floor, Malachi bent down and touched the floor with his fingers, almost as if he needed confirmation that he was actually on the floor. Standing back up, with a tight grip onto the edge of the freezer door, Malachi took a quick survey of his friend. He could see immediately that Eddie was in fact breathing. Reaching out towards Eddie with one hand, the other still tightly gripped onto the edge of the door and its rubber seal, Malachi carefully placed his hand onto the side of Eddie's neck. Instantly Malachi could tell that something about his friend's condition was not right. Malachi had known for a long time that Ronnie's and his own skin temperature was much lower than that of anyone else's. Along with this knowledge, he had also known that Ronnie's and his own heart rate and respirations were much faster than anyone else's. Now, as he held his hand to Eddie's neck, he discovered that all of the differences were now in common with Eddie. Suddenly Eddie's eyes opened and then stared directly at Malachi, causing him to jump backwards. Malachi? What's going on? Eddie asked as he saw an instant look of terror on his face. I don't know. Something strange is happening though. Malachi responded as he had also attempted to catch his own composure. Can you get up? Yeah. I think so anyway. Then Eddie slowly sat up on the edge of the freezer. I feel alright. Watch out so that I can jump down. With this, Malachi stepped back a couple of paces and watched his friend land firmly on the floor of the garage. Stepping back towards Eddie, Malachi put his hand on Eddie's shoulder. Do you feel alright? Yeah. What happened? I remember you biting me behind your house, and then suddenly I'm waking up on the top of this freezer. Malachi, what's going on? As he spoke to Malachi, Eddie had also felt the side of his own neck. Really, Eddie, I don't know what's happening. But I do think that it would be a good idea to keep this to ourselves. Come on, let's go back outside with Nicole and Ronnie before my family figures out that something is wrong, Also Eddie, let's keep this a secret from everyone, Malachi said as he opened the garage door. Prior to going into the garage, in fact the entire morning for that matter, there was a slight cloud cover that had been hiding the sun. Now, as Malachi and Eddie regrouped with Ronnie and Nicole, the sun was shining brightly from the west. Beyond just stepping out from the poorly lighted garage, the bright sunlight hadn't only blinded Malachi but had also seemed to irritate his eyes like never before. In an attempt to refocus his eyes, Malachi looked down to the ground as he stopped walking, causing Eddie to run right into him. "What's wrong, Malachi?" Nicole asked as she walked over to him as he had his eyes closed. The bright rays of sunlight hadn't bothered Eddie, however, he was scratching the side of his head trying to make sense of the last few moments. With his other hand, Eddie was still feeling the side of his neck where it had seemed that Malachi's bite marks had completely vanished. "I can't see," Malachi responded. "The sun is too bright," he continued. As Nicole continued to look at Malachi, as she patted him on the back, she had noticed that it appeared that Malachi was getting a slight sunburn. "Hey guys," Nicole announced, "let's go in and play in the basement. Too many weird things are happening today." "You don't know but half of it," Malachi responded as he let Nicole guide him into the back door of the basement. "Neither one of you guys know but half of it," Eddie interrupted as he followed close behind Malachi, Nicole, and Ronnie into the basement door. "What do you mean?" Malachi asked as he could now see just fine as he looked back towards Eddie. Malachi's friend still had the side of his neck covered with his hand. Also, as Malachi looked down towards Eddie's feet, he could see that Spud was aggressively biting tight onto the hemmed edge of Eddie's jeans. "Spud, leave him alone," Malachi snapped. "What I mean is that where you had just bit me has already totally healed. I don't feel anything on the side of my neck," Eddie continued as he removed his hand to show Malachi. "Now that's real weird," Nicole repeated herself. "I'm gonna go tell Mom that we're gonna play in the basement for now," Ronnie said as he headed for the stairs. "Ronnie, make sure that that's all that you tell her. I don't want her to know anything about what's happened," Malachi said, then put his own hand on the side of Eddie's neck confirming what he had said. "That is real weird." With this said, Malachi suddenly hushed himself as he thought about what happened in the garage. "Malachi." Nearly jumping off of the floor, Malachi turned to face Ronnie as he yelled his name. "What, Ronnie? I just called your name like 4 or 5 times, Malachi. Why don't you join us down here on Earth and come up with something for us to do?" Ronnie said sarcastically. Looking at Nicole and then Eddie, whose mind seemed to also be elsewhere, Malachi tried to snap his own mind off of the recent events. "How about we play Scrabble? That's a game that we all know how to play. Or Monopoly, or hide and go seek." "Hide and go seek? Malachi, I think that we are getting to be a bit too old for that game," Nicole retorted. "Well then how about you guys come up with something while I go get a drink of water? Or even better, how about I go make some Kool-Aid for us and then I'll bring it in some cups downstairs?" Malachi suggested. "That sounds like a plan. Hurry up though." Nicole pushed and then walked towards the red oak closet, in the corner of the basement, where the board games were kept. Malachi had more than less jogged up the first half of the stairs before he turned to head up the last half. Then, just as he made his left hand turn for the second flight of steps, Malachi had suddenly found himself rising to the top of the staircase, without even touching the steps and extremely fast. As he quickly found himself at the top of the stairs, he landed on both of his feet and then instantly fell to his knees, startling his mom and grandmother as they were just finishing the dishes. "Malachi, you know better than running up the stairs, or in the house for that matter," Karina said as she turned to see her oldest son picking himself up off of the floor. "I know. I'm sorry, Mom," Malachi said and then paused for a moment to think about what had just happened. "What is happening to me?" Malachi thought to himself. "Ronnie, come up here real quick. I need you." Malachi had decided that the use of his extrasensory perception would be best used with all of the extra confusion. "Hey guys." Ronnie spoke up as Nicole and Eddie went through the closet. "I'll be back in a second, I've gotta go tell Malachi something." Then, less than a minute later, Ronnie was standing by his brother's side. "Hey Malachi. What's happening?" "Ronnie. I know that I said that I would do it, but would you please make the Kool-Aid along with enough sandwiches for all of us? I'm not feeling right. I think something's wrong, but I don't want Mom to know. Please. I'll do it. How about you go back downstairs with Eddie and Nicole? At least now I know to watch both you and Eddie. Thank you, Ronnie. I owe you, Malachi said, then turned to head back down the steps. As Malachi carefully walked down the first flight of stairs, he held onto the railing. As he reached the first landing, near the door, he was very thankful that he had gotten that far without incident. Then, before taking a step down the next flight of stairs, Malachi reached out, with his hand, to grasp the next railing. As he continued down the steps, he was about halfway down when he decided that he was safe enough to let go of the handrail. Simultaneously, as he let his hand free, he once again found himself flying down the last half of the steps, falling to his knees. Malachi. Are you all right? Nicole screeched loudly as she saw what she thought was Malachi falling down the steps. Yeah. I'll be all right. Malachi responded as he was becoming scared of whatever it was causing him to seemingly fly. I think that I just need to sit down for a while. On May 29th, 5 days after Malachi's birthday, Nicole's graduation ceremony at the Craig High School was set to begin at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Nicole's parents, Malachi's parents, Ronnie, and then a few other people, such as Mr. and Mrs. Bruce, next door, and Mr. and Mrs. Alberts, from across the street, were all there. Throughout the 5 days, since Malachi's birthday, Malachi had become used to the episodes of flight, levitation, and hovering. To say that he had become used to it, however, meant that he understood better how to control it. He quickly realized that the episodes only took place with his intention of movement within any given direction. Malachi. Are you ready to go up to the high school? We'll take the car so that we won't have to walk with the traffic going to and from the school. All right, David said as he stood in the doorway to Malachi's room. Yeah, I'm ready, Dad. I'm just not so excited about wearing this suit. The inseam is too long, and the buttons look real tacky. Also, if this tie gets any tighter, I won't be getting any blood flow to my brain. Malachi, it's only for the ceremony, after that you can take the tie off. You do want to make a good impression for Nicole's big day, don't you? David continued. Yes, Dad, I do. And that is the only reason that I'm wearing it. Well, if it helps you feel any better, I don't exactly like my suit either. And, for the most part, for the same reasons. I hate ties. Dave reasoned, then turned and left the room. Within just a few hours the graduation was over, and then a graduation party followed it. It was arranged, prior to the graduation, for the party to take place at the Declue residence. The first reason being that there was a lot of space for people to mingle around, as opposed to the Ridgeview apartments where Nicole and her parents still lived. The second reason that the Declue's house was chosen is that it was close enough to the high school for people to leave their cars at the school's parking lot and walk to the house. They wouldn't have to worry about cluttering up the driveway. With the exception of the few bright sunny hours at Malachi's birthday, there was a lot of overcast that had lasted since then. According to the local radio station, with its disc jockey, Tony St. John, this day Nicole's graduation was predicted to be clear out with a high in the mid-90s. As the graduation ceremony came to an end, however, and party guests were walking their way to Malachi's house, it appeared that the weather report, as usual, was wrong. During the ceremony it had rained outside, only stopping as the ceremony came to an end. Then, about an hour into the party, the overcast had began to clear up. Hey Malachi. Would you like to go outside for a while? Nicole asked as she noticed that Malachi was staring out the window. As Malachi turned to face Nicole, it was obvious that his eyes were already having problems with just the light through the window. His eyes had watered up and had turned red. There was a beam of sunlight that had run across his fingers, as he rested his hand on the windowsill prior to Nicole calling his name. As he turned to face Nicole, it looked as though Malachi had stripes on his fingers. I don't think that I should. Look at my hand. Malachi raised his fingers to show Nicole. Well, maybe tonight we can go take a walk, Nicole said as she wrapped her arms around him. I love you so much, Malachi. And, thanks to you and your family, I have had the coolest graduation party ever. I love you too, Nicole. I think that maybe a walk tonight sounds great. At this, Malachi rested his head on her chest and tightened his grip on her. There was perfect silence for about 5 minutes when suddenly the telephone began to ring, almost causing Malachi to jump into Nicole's arms. Seconds later you could hear someone, in the living room, answer the phone. Then, just moments later, Karenin yelled down the hall saying that the call was for Malachi. Before picking up the telephone in his room, Malachi saw, by the caller ID, that the call was from the Yish residence. The call is from Eddie. Malachi told Nicole, and then picked up the receiver. Hello. Hey Malachi, this is Eddie. Can I please come over to see you? Something is wrong with me, and I think that it had to do with the other day. Well yeah. Eddie, you haven't told anyone about what happened, have you? No. Honestly, however, I have been tempted to say something just because a few things are terribly wrong and scaring me. Alright Eddie. I want you to come directly over here right now. Don't say anything to anyone, just come over here. Okay Malachi. What about if I ask my parents if I can stay the night at your house, that way maybe you can get my head straight on my shoulders about this stuff. Eddie, don't say anything more on the phone, ask your parents if you can spend the night and then come right over. Alright. Alright Malachi, I'll see you in about 15 minutes. That's good Eddie. One more thing, when you get over here just walk on in. You know where my bedroom is. Nicole and I are both here, we'll wait for you. Alright. See you in a couple, Eddie said, and then the phone went dead. Hanging up the phone, Malachi went over to Nicole and wrapped his arms around her. What's happening with Eddie? I'm not quite 100% sure myself of what is happening. Remember the other night, on my birthday, when those strange things happened to Eddie, after I bit him? Well yeah. Of course I remember. I've never saw, or witnessed, anything quite like that bite healing so quick. I'll never forget. Nicole. There are a lot of other things that happened, in the garage, while I was helping Eddie. And then later, after we went into the basement. Also. Something has happened that is causing me to not be able to be in direct sunlight. And now, something is happening to Eddie that is scaring him? What happened in the garage and the basement, Malachi? And why haven't you said anything to me about it until now? Nicole asked as she looked him in the eyes. First of all Nicole. The reason that I haven't said anything to you is because I'm still confused about what is happening. Some extremely weird things are happening and they are scaring me too. And now Eddie is scared. Pausing for a moment, Malachi let go of his hug onto Nicole. Please sit down with me on the edge of the bed. There are a lot of things that I need to talk to you about. Then, just as the two of them sat on the bed, Eddie walked into the room. Hey Malachi. My mom said that I could stay the night. That's good Eddie. Now please come over here and sit down next to Nicole and I. We have a lot to talk about. I'm gonna start Eddie, then, when I'm done, you can tell me what's going on with you. Malachi instructed in a matter of which was starting to worry Nicole. Now listen guys. Malachi started as he turned his head to the left to make eye contact with Nicole, and then to the right to make eye contact with Eddie. It's gonna be hard for both of you to understand what I'm about to tell you. The reason that it's gonna be hard for you to understand is because most of the issues that I'm about to talk about are issues that most people grow up with being taught to believe is only myth or science fiction. Now listen. No matter how strange this sounds, please don't interrupt. Let me finish. Looking towards the floor, Malachi took a deep breath. As you two know, or anyone that isn't blind, my brother and I have always had extremely long canine's teeth. Then, as he turned to the left, to face Nicole again, he continued. Nicole has known me my entire life. She can personally vouch for me that our teeth have been like this our entire lives. At this Nicole looked around Malachi to Eddie and nodded her head yes. The reason is, and once again, please bear with me, the reason is because Ronnie and I are vampires. For a moment Malachi didn't look directly at either Eddie or Nicole, in fact he just stared at the floor between his own feet. A lot or most people have heard of the Salem witch trials back in the 19th century. Just like the witch trials, vampires are just as real. My great-great-grandfather's name was Miguel Sanchez. He was born in 1775. Prior to his execution several years later, he was accused of and charged with the murders of several people. This is the ultimate reason that he was executed. For the most part, most vampires no longer exist. There are a few, however. My family consists of over half of those that do still exist. Ronnie and I have both made mistakes in the past that have caused the death of two of our friends. By the corner of Malachi's eye, he could see Nicole covering her mouth with her hand. Ronnie and I both have extrasensory perception that allows us to read the minds of other people and their thoughts have to do with us. Then, as we celebrated my birthday the other day, I had bit Eddie. After I bit him, he felt almost instantly sick. We went into the garage and then Eddie completely passed out. As I tried to lift him onto the top of the freezer, I suddenly found him to be as light as a feather. Then, as I went to lift him, I suddenly found myself to be floating above the freezer with Eddie in my arms. Then later, after we went into the basement, I had gone upstairs to make Kool-Aid and, once again, either flew or floated up the steps. This scared me. That's why I had Ronnie make it for me. Then, on my way back down the steps, I once again flew down the stairs and then landed on my knees when I tried to stop. I remember you falling down to your knees. Nicole interrupted, I thought that you fell down the stairs. Throughout mine and Ronnie's lives we have had a few things, besides our teeth, that has always set us aside from others around us. Our body temperature is much lower than anyone else's and our heart rate and respirations are much higher than anyone else. When Eddie was passed out on the freezer, after I bit him, I found that all of those differences within us were immediately the same as Eddie's. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Eddie interrupted, everything except the flying, or floating thing that you're about. Eddie, you've got to understand that all of this has to remain a secret from everyone. Including your parents. If you need someone to talk to me or Ronnie. And, I guess now, Nicole. Lifting both of his arms, Malachi lightly wrapped his left arm around Nicole and then his right arm around Eddie. Guys, listen. This all has to stay right here between us. My mom and my grandma Sanchez knows about Ronnie and I, but they will get worried if they found out that anyone else knows. Malachi, does this have anything to do with Lloyd and James dying? Nicole asked quietly. Turning his head, to face Nicole, as he continued to keep an arm on both her and Eddie, his eyes began to water up. Yeah. That is exactly why they died. Their deaths, however, were by accident, Nicole. I promise. At this a tear ran down Malachi's cheek. Am I gonna die, Malachi? Eddie asked. Eddie immediately remembered that, in the past, two of Ronnie's and Malachi's died in their home. No, Eddie. Honestly, Eddie, I think that you have become a vampire too. Just like Ronnie and I. You guys see. In the past Ronnie and I have only had the ability of ESP and these long canines. Now, since I've turned 13 years old, I am flying and then my bite has become venomous, causing someone else, you Eddie, to be the same as Ronnie and I. Hey Malachi. Eddie interrupted again, my upper canines, on both sides, have become very loose. They're about to fall out. As Eddie said this, Malachi realized just how hard it'd be to hide things from others around Eddie, his family, people at school. Malachi was suddenly lost for words. Malachi. My 13th birthday is day after tomorrow, Eddie said as he stared his peer in the face. With this said, the loss of words had now also turned into fear. A fear that was so great that Nicole could sense it through Malachi's arm that was still wrapped around her. Okay guys. Listen, Nicole said as she immediately stood up. Turning to face both Eddie and Malachi, she quickly got down onto her knees as the boys continued to sit on the edge of the mattress. Taking up Malachi's right hand into her own right hand, and then Eddie's left hand in her left hand, she began to speak very softly, yet firm enough to show them that she was very serious in taking charge of the situation. Presuming that in a couple of days, Eddie is gonna have these additional abilities, just the same as Malachi, we have to do everything that it will take to keep it unknown. Eddie and Malachi. You two have to become the best of friends. You need to be with each other on everything that you do or plan to do in the near future and then beyond. Eddie, you might as well plan on making every excuse possible to spend the night with Malachi every night. Malachi, You said that your mom and grandmother know everything about you and Ronnie. Now it's time for them to know about Eddie and to let them know that I know as well. School's out for the season, there is no reason for any of us to be apart from each other. We will spend time outside at night. From now on we will be all upfront with Malachi's mom and grandma about any changes with anything. We will, from now on, all be upfront with each other as well. All of us are going to keep this only between the three of us, and then, of course, Karina and Mrs. Sanchez. Ronnie too, of course. We are going to do this together, guys. In silence. Letting go of their hands, she then put her hands firmly on both of their waists and pulled both of them tightly close together and towards herself. We can do this as a team, guys. Now let's get my graduation party over with so that we can decide exactly how to confront Malachi's mom and grandmother. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the bedroom door. "Come in," Malachi said loudly enough to be heard. "Hey guys." "Oh, hi Eddie, nice to see you," Karina said as she pushed the door open. "I hope that you guys plan to join the party out here. This party is for you, Nicole." "We're sorry. We got to talking and momentarily forgot." Nicole spoke up. "Ah, Mrs. DeClue. Later, after the graduation party, the three of us really need to talk to you about something important. If you get a chance to talk to us alone, would you please?" "Well, yeah, Nicole. We can do that. Anything that I should be worried about?" "No." Nicole answered as she thought for a second on a way to hint to her what the conversation would be about. "Things are sort of vamped out between us." At this, Karina's face went blank. "Okay guys, we will talk as soon as everyone leaves. Malachi, I'm gonna involve your grandma Sanchez in this conversation too. Understand?" "Yeah. I understand," Malachi said quietly. "Mrs. DeClue. It's not Malachi's fault. Some things accidentally took place since Malachi's birthday that have all three of us involved. Nobody else knows and we don't plan for anyone else to know, but we feel that you should know." Then, as all three followed Karina out of the room, Nicole continued. "Mrs. DeClue. I think that it would be imperative that Eddie and I both stay the night. If that's okay with you." "Honestly, Nicole. I don't think that we really have a choice. Now, let's not talk about it anymore until later. Okay?" "All right, Mrs. DeClue." Then, as she turned to face Eddie, Nicole continued. "Eddie. Go back into Malachi's bedroom and quickly remake the bed for us. We just messed it up." "Okay. Good idea," Malachi added and then continued to follow Nicole out to the living room as Eddie turned to head back into the bedroom. The gathering lasted for about another 2 to 3 hours. As usual, towards the end of the party, both Karina and Mrs. Sanchez washed the dishes. "Hey Mom." "Yeah, dear?" The older woman responded as she finished pulling out the drying rack from under the counter. "We have a serious, possibly serious, problem that we need to talk about," Karina said as she turned on the faucet. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Sanchez's voice was suddenly firm and serious as she turned to face her daughter. "A couple of hours ago I had noticed that Nicole and Malachi had disappeared. I went and found them, along with Eddie, in Malachi's bedroom. Nicole informed me that they have something very important to talk to me about. I asked her if something was wrong, then she answered no. She said that things are sort of vamped out and expressed the urgency that they all talk with me. I told them that I would involve you into the conversation." "Where is David?" Mrs. Sanchez asked as she looked as though she was lost for words. "I think that he walked with the Bruce family back to their house and then he was gonna walk back up to the school to get our car." "Well, let's go to Malachi's bedroom and get this over with," Mrs. Sanchez said and then walked out of the kitchen. "What should we tell them?" Eddie asked as he sat in front of Malachi's computer. "We need to tell them everything. We need to start with Malachi's birthday, when he bit. Can't we leave that part out?" Malachi spoke for the first time since they went back into the bedroom. "No, Malachi. That is an important step in the progress of events that have taken place here," Nicole said loudly. Then, as she finished speaking, a knock on the door caused everyone, including Nicole, to jump. "Come in." Malachi said as he sat up on the bed. Hey guys, Karina said as the two women walked into the room. Well, we do have a lot to talk about, and right now is a good time to get started. Eddie, how about you go get onto the bed with Malachi and Nicole so that my mom can sit there? All right, honey. Yes, ma'am. Eddie responded and then did as he was asked to. Eddie. Mrs. Sanchez started. You're a very polite kid. I like to see that in a person your age. At the positive comment, Eddie smiled back at the older women. Well, Nicole. Malachi's mom says that we have some important business to talk about. Would you like to start? At first Nicole didn't know exactly where to start, and so she sat there for a moment with a blank look on her face. Well, I guess to put it right, it would be best to put it out from my point of view. As you know, Mrs. Sanchez, I've known Ronnie and Malachi their entire lives. I've known all along, hard not to, that they naturally have long teeth. I've never put any thought into it because I've never known it to be any different with them. Then, 5 days ago, on Malachi's birthday, something happened. Malachi was only playing, he didn't mean any harm, but in the course of playing around he bit Eddie on the neck. Eddie almost immediately felt sick, and then Malachi walked him into the garage and left Ronnie and I outside. Okay. Stop there, Nicole. Malachi. What happened in the garage? Mrs. Sanchez interrupted. When we get to you leaving the garage, Nicole will resume her side of the story. Well, Eddie felt sick, and so I decided to hide the incident by allowing Eddie to be in the garage until he felt better. We walked over to the big freezer so that Eddie could lay down on it. When I attempted to help him up, I found myself floating, with Eddie in my arms, at the level of which would have been enough to put him on the freezer. This incident scared me. But then I found that Eddie had passed out on the freezer. When I started to pay closer attention to Eddie's body, I realized that his breathing, heart rate, and body temperature was suddenly exactly that of mine and Ronnie's. Then suddenly Eddie opened his eyes and scared me. Hold on a minute, Malachi. I know I said that you would be next, Nicole, but I want to hear from Eddie first. Eddie, what happened when you opened your eyes while you were on the freezer? Well, first I saw Malachi jump backwards. I think that I scared him. Then I sat up on the edge of the freezer, felt my neck. It was odd, the bite marks were already gone. Then I jumped down onto the floor and walked back outside with Nicole. All right, Nicole. Take over from here. The sun had come out just seconds prior to Eddie and Malachi coming out of the garage. When Malachi walked out into the sun, he had immediately got burned on his back, and then his eyes started to water up. I said, let's go into the basement. We did, and then Malachi went upstairs to make some Kool-Aid. Wait a minute. Karina interrupted. Ronnie made some Kool-Aid, then left sugar on the counter afterwards. Mom. First I went upstairs to make Kool-Aid. On the way up, on the second flight of stairs, I started, once again, to experience as if I was flying. This scared me so, through our ESP, I had Ronnie come upstairs to make some. Then, on the way back downstairs, it happened again. Both times, when I came upstairs, and then again when I went downstairs, I fell to my knees when I stopped. And that's when I thought that you were running up the stairs. Karina interrupted again. Yes. And that's also when I thought that you fell down the stairs. Right? Nicole added. Yeah. It's from this flying problem. Malachi answered, then paused. Then what happened? Mrs. Sanchez asked. Today, during the graduation party, Eddie called over here saying that he's been experiencing some problems ever since my birthday. I told him to come over here. Malachi answered. That's when I came in, Mom. The three of them wanted to talk about it with us. They're pretty shook up about the whole thing. There's one more problem, Grandma. Malachi stood up from the bed and walked towards his mom and grandmother. What's that, Malachi? The day after tomorrow Eddie turns 13 years old. Well, I must say, when you kids pick a snowball fight, you really know how to mix a chunk of ice into the situation. Mrs. Sanchez started as she stood up to stretch her legs. Eddie, does anyone outside of this room know anything about what has happened? Only Ronnie. I haven't said anything to anyone outside of this room. Well, Eddie, that is a good thing. Now listen, guys. Malachi, Go ahead and sit back down with Nicole and Eddie. All of you guys have made the right choice in keeping this quiet. Pausing for a moment, Mrs. Sanchez walked over by Eddie's side. Eddie, lift your shirt for me. Then, after Eddie followed her directions, she put her hand on Eddie's chest. It's very good that you've kept this quiet, Eddie. Then, taking a seat on the bed next to Eddie, with both Malachi and Nicole sitting together on the opposite side, she continued. Eddie, it's important for you to understand that you are not the same person that you were prior to Malachi's birthday. You are a living, breathing vampire. Vampires are not myth. They are real, and as real as you and I are sitting here together with Karina, Malachi, and Nicole. As a vampire, you have powers that are unlike any that any human will ever comprehend. In 2 days from now, on your 13th birthday, you will inherit more powers that will give you unlimited motion of movement. However, at the same time, you will also inherit allergies that can devastate your life, or destroy you. With these powers, Eddie, you have the ability to either devastate or destroy someone else's life. Your silence, however, in regards to our existence, can mean the difference of our survival or our devastation and destruction. Nobody, outside of this room, can know about this, Eddie. Ever. This includes your own family, Eddie. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Nicole. Turning her head towards Malachi and Nicole, she continued in the same firm, stern voice, you are the only person in this room that isn't a vampire. You are what we call a daywalker. The only thing is that even females that are vampires can walk out into the sunlight. Those that are not vampires are called daywalkers. You, Nicole, may at some point in your life decide that you want to become one of us. There are benefits to being one of us. You'll live a life of about 200 years old. If you and Malachi decide to have children, those kids will spend their lives protecting you. That will be your children's predestined mission in life. The only things that can kill a vampire is holy water, direct sunlight, and cardio penetration. Either way that you choose, however, all of what you know and have heard must stay in this room. Do you understand? Yeah. I understand. Well then, the rest is up to you and Malachi. Then turning her head back to face Eddie, she continued. Eddie. ESP stands for extrasensory perception. Only male vampires have ESP. This allows you to know and understand what someone is thinking in regards to yourself. You'll receive someone's thoughts about yourself, in the same manner of which you can hear my voice right now. Then, as Mrs. Sanchez stood up and began to walk towards the door, she turned to face the kids one last time. Do you have any questions, guys? Then, without an answer, both Karina and Mrs. Sanchez headed out the door. Well, guys, I think that we all clearly understand what's up. Right? Nicole asked as she stood up. What am I going to do? Eddie asked. It's like my whole life has changed. Then, on my birthday, what hasn't changed will change. What am I gonna do? He repeated himself. You're gonna try your best to adjust yourself to what your new life is now. You will never be back to how you were. What you were before is part of your past. You can't change it, and so you can only get used to it. I'm not saying this to be rude, Eddie, Malachi continued. I'm saying this because this is your new reality. Like my grandmother said though, only we can know about this. Alright? Yeah. Well, good. Let's figure out what we're gonna do for the rest of the day, and then tonight. Malachi finished. Later that night, about 10 o'clock, Malachi, Nicole, and Eddie all headed out the door. Well, where do you guys want to go? Nicole asked as she grabbed a hold of Malachi's hand. Let's go up to the Sand Rocks. Eddie suggested. I've never been up there before. Are you serious? Malachi turned his head nearly completely around on his shoulders to face Eddie as he followed close behind. Yeah, in fact the high school is the closest to the Sand Rocks that I've ever been. And that was to go swimming. Eddie explained, and then quickly took a few large paces so that he was side by side with Malachi and Nicole. It is a little dark out here to be on the Sand Rocks though, Nicole said as they continued to walk. But then again, I guess that we should probably get used to being out at dark. The Sand Rocks would probably be about the best place for us to be. Learn to watch your step real quick up there. Malachi added. The Sand Rocks would also be a good place to avoid curfew, Eddie said, and then looked over to Malachi, If your mom is working at night, we wouldn't even have to worry about curfew. Nah. My mom only works mornings. Unless someone calls in sick, then she'll cover for them, Malachi continued. Or, Nicole interrupted, I have been thinking about getting a job at the police department. I'm out of school now and it is a job that I've had a lot of interest in. Looking towards Nicole, a smile grew across Malachi's face. You never told me that you were interested in law enforcement. Pausing for a moment, Malachi looked out over a field off of the right side of the road just prior to the sand rocks. I think that's cool, Nicole. It only took about 10 minutes to reach the bottom edge of the sand rocks from the time that they had left the house. Are we gonna start from the top or the bottom? Eddie questioned as the three of them grouped together. I think that it would be safer to start at the bottom. What do you think? Malachi asked Nicole as he reached out for her hand. Well, yeah, that would be safer, but where is the sense of adventure in that? I think that it would be more exciting to head for the top and then head towards the far end, Nicole continued. The far end, of which extends out towards the eastern direction, ends just short of the area of town where the Craig Middle School is located. In between there is vast areas of heights up to about 200 feet, overlooking the entire community of Craig, Colorado. The total length of the walk is between 3 to 5 miles. In between, steep ledges, cactus plants, darkness, and predator animals. Okay. You're right, Nicole, that would be a bit more exciting. Let's make sure, however, that we don't become late-night dinner to some wolf or mountain lion. Yo. Eddie interrupted as he immediately stopped. What do you mean dinner to some wolf or mountain lion? I'm not so sure that I'm so ready for that type of adventure. Don't worry, Eddie. Malachi spoke up loudly. Those animals are scared of humans. Unless of course you're weak and fall behind like the animals on the Discovery Channel do prior to being eaten alive. In that case you might have something to worry about. At this Malachi turned to face Nicole and winked at her. Almost fluently Eddie immediately began to walk, catching up to Nicole and Malachi, then passing them. Well, how about I lead the way? All I have to do is stay on the edge of the sand rock. Right? Eddie asked as he turned his head to face his friends. Suddenly, just as Eddie had turned his head, he caught the toe of his right shoe in a crack upon the sand rock, causing him to fall forward. Quickly, throwing both of his hands forward to break his fall, Eddie found himself to be too close to the ledge, leaving him nothing but air and a drop of at least 100 feet down. For a moment it seemed, to Eddie, that all that he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat as he found himself falling, head first, off of the steep cliff. The fall seemed to be in slow motion as many things suddenly flashed through his mind. Then, as his eyes began to focus on a large rock at the foot of the sand rocks, almost at the time of impact, he suddenly came to a slamming stop within Malachi's arms. At first Eddie dared himself to open his eyes, wondering if his current feeling were of life or the sudden sensation of life after death. Without opening his eyes he felt as though he was within the fetal position, being held under his knees and by the center of his back. Just hold on a minute, Eddie. We're almost back to the top, Malachi assured his friend. With that said, Eddie just stared into Malachi's face as they slowly reached the cliff of the sand rocks that had almost claimed his life. Then, as they came to where Nicole had been standing alone, Malachi carefully and slowly landed firmly on his feet. Rather than leaving the refuge of his friend's arms, Eddie continued to relax as he still stared deeply into Malachi's face. Eddie! Malachi hollered. Eddie suddenly jumped as he realized that his friend was calling his name. Come on now. You're not exactly a feather, you know. Then, as he carefully climbed out of Malachi's arms, he stepped back a couple of paces, then continued to stare at Malachi in awe. You know, Eddie. In just a couple more days you too will be able to fly just as I did when I caught you. You might as well just get used to it. This is gonna be a part of our lives for possibly eternity. Between now and then though, you need to watch your step, man. There isn't anything out here that will hurt you. There are animals out here, but they are normally scared of humans. Just relax and enjoy the walk. When we start to get tired we'll head back to my house. All right, Malachi. Eddie answered in a more relaxed tone of voice, and thank you for catching me. I thought that L was doomed. With that said, the three of them continued with their journey. The walk took a total of about 5 hours for the round trip. Along the way all three of them enjoyed the hike. Then, as they walked into the house at about 3 in the morning, they all quietly headed into Malachi's bedroom. Moments later they were asleep. It was about 7 in the morning when the blinding rays from the sun glared Ronnie's vision. Pulling the corner edge of his comforter over his face, he continued to rest his head on his cotton-filled pillow. As he listened carefully, he figured that everyone else was still asleep. He knew that his brother, Nicole, and Eddie had come home sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning. He had stayed up until about 2 o'clock writing emails to a friend of his named Belinda, a peer at school that he had gained a crush on. Up to this point Malachi, Nicole, nor Eddie had come home. Belinda was only about 4 months older than Ronnie. Short and slightly heavy-set with a smile that had drawn his attraction. Ronnie had known Belinda since kindergarten but only by name. Though they were in the same grade together, they had been separated into 2 different classrooms. This particular school season, however, that had come to an end, the two were both in the same class together. Rather, if Belinda was aware of it or not, Ronnie had a crush on her that had continued to grow throughout the school season. Staying up late at night, emailing Belinda, had become routine. As Ronnie continued to lay down and stare at particles of dust that seemed to dance around the room, his hearing began to focus on a faint voice that could barely be heard. Lifting himself up to one elbow, Ronnie closed his eyes in an effort to listen more carefully to what almost sounded like a chant. It seemed, to Ronnie, that the sound was coming through the wall that separated his own room from Malachi's. Quickly getting up out of bed, Ronnie crept down to one knee up against the wall. Turning his head, facing his bedroom door, Ronnie carefully placed his ear against the wall in an effort to hear what the source of the sound was. As he did this, he could clearly hear Eddie's voice through the wall. Only Eddie's voice, as though he was talking to someone, yet Ronnie could not make out anything that would hint on to someone other than just Eddie himself. Eddie was asking questions, then pausing, as if he was waiting for a response. As Ronnie continued to listen carefully, he had come up with the assumption that Eddie wasn't receiving a response from whatever, or whoever it was that he was trying to communicate with. What is he doing? Ronnie thought to himself. Since arriving back to the house early that morning, Eddie had attempted to sleep the best that he could. With his attempts, however, images had raced through his mind of the falling incident the night before. What had originally scared him about being a vampire had now become more of a fantasy as he thought about the upcoming changes that would occur on his 13th birthday. Flying, staying outside at night, every night, like he had always wanted to in the past that his parents wouldn't allow. That alone prompted another problem. If his parents wouldn't allow him to stay up late before, why would they allow him to do so now? Without them knowing about the truth, that is. Eddie was well aware of the dangers if other people were to find out. With a personal level of high respect for Mrs. Sanchez's words the night before, Eddie knew that he had to come up with a way to avoid telling his parents anything. Yet he also knew that he had to come up with a way, or excuse, to be able to adapt to the changes that would soon occur. About 5 years earlier, Eddie had gained a lot of interest in the ability for some people to communicate with the dead. He had watched many programs on television about EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon, plus many other relevant programming that had prompted him to learn about seances, a way to communicate with the dead. Now, after waking up very early to the bright sun coming through the window, Eddie was trying to communicate with a past friend of both himself and Malachi's named Lloyd Bruce. Eddie knew that Lloyd had died in Malachi's home. He also knew that Lloyd used to live next door. In fact, Lloyd's parents still lived next door. What Eddie didn't know, however, is that Lloyd had died in the very room that he was currently in. Eddie's concentration on this particular seance was suddenly interrupted by a sudden feeling that someone, outside of the bedroom, was thinking about him. Since the incident of being bit by Malachi, on Malachi's birthday, Eddie had found himself being able to read the minds of others around him when their thoughts pertained to him. Today was no exception, as he was easily distracted from his attempt to do a seance after lighting 6 candles that he had carefully placed around himself. Around the candles, then in the center, he made a star, within the circle, with string that he had carefully thumbtacked to the floor. Carefully, and quietly, Ronnie stood back up and then quietly exited the bedroom. Tiptoeing, To avoid any sudden noises, Ronnie walked down towards Malachi's bedroom floor where he, once again, crept down to his knees and then placed his ear to the door, as he had just done to the wall in his own room. At first Ronnie didn't really hear anything, however, as he continued to listen he could see what looked like flickering light flashing under the door's edge. Moments later, Ronnie could hear Eddie's voice again, this time much more clear as he could hear Eddie speaking, once again, to himself. "Lloyd. Are you present? If you are, please show me a sign or yourself." Ronnie was shocked by what he was hearing. Nearly having to pick his own jaw up off of the floor, he continued to listen as Eddie repeated himself several times. After about 15 minutes, not knowing whether to laugh, burst into the room to yell at Eddie for what he felt was an extremely demented mind, or just go back into his own room and forget that whole incident, Ronnie had decided to just get up and walk back to his bedroom. Then, just as he stood up, Ronnie suddenly heard a second voice. The sound of the other voice had instantly put a chill up his back as his legs had also, simultaneously, nearly given out from under his own body weight. Back into his kneeling position, Ronnie could now barely hear himself breathe as all of his attention was now directed to the voices within Malachi's bedroom. Eddie's voice, and then the demoniac voice that followed, seemed to deepen the level of concentration as Ronnie continued to listen. Eddie was quite shocked by the results of the seance. As he held perfectly still he could hear the voice of what he had hoped was that of his friend, Lloyd Bruce. The voice was extremely low-pitched sounding, almost like that of a man rather than that of an 8-year-old, of which Lloyd was when he had died. Just moments after the demoniac voice began, an image had suddenly appeared above the circle and star. This image, like a hologram, seemed to float in the air as it stared at Eddie. At first Eddie was scared as he found himself staring into the eyes of his late friend. Through his moment of fright, Eddie was momentarily lost for words as he listened to the voice that had quickly become more of that he had remembered of Lloyd. "Eddie," Lloyd began, "why have you brought me back to this place? Don't you know that this is where I had taken my last breath?" Then, looking towards where Malachi and Nicole were asleep on the bed, he continued. "Eddie. I died on that bed." "Lloyd. What happened to you that night? How did you die?" Pausing for a moment Eddie was, once again, lost for words as he continued to stare at Lloyd. "It was an accident, Eddie. Nobody intentionally killed me. Malachi and I were playing in the garage, with Power Ranger figures, when I had accidentally fallen off of the big white freezer and cut myself on a nail before I landed on the floor. After I had fallen and got cut, Malachi and I came up to his bedroom. I laid down on his bed while Malachi cleaned out the cut. After it was cleaned out I allowed Malachi to harvest off of my blood. As he was harvesting I died. He didn't do it intentionally. I was his best friend as he was mine as well." Pausing for a moment Lloyd stared, what seemed like deeper than what he already was, at Eddie. "Eddie, I know what you are. I know that you are, like Ronnie and Malachi, a vampire. You need to realize that you are still an important person. You are perhaps one of Malachi's best friends. If not the best friend that he has. In one day from now. Just as Malachi's grandmother told you last night, you will have powers beyond the comprehension of any normal human being. Soon you'll find yourself to have deep thirst for blood. This is okay, so long as you don't take too much out of any one person. Take your new abilities and live with them in peace and turn them into something positive." "But Lloyd. I'm scared. I'm scared of being different than those around me. Also, how am I gonna get around my parents without them knowing or finding out that something about me is different? How am I gonna convince them to allow me to stay out late at night, or understand that I'm okay when I chose to not go outside during the daytime? Eddie. I can't tell you exactly how, however, I can tell you that everything will work out for you. Sometimes Eddie, you just have to trust that everything will be alright. Also, make sure that you always listen to Mrs. Sanchez, Malachi's mom, Malachi, and Malachi's brother. Will I be able to see and talk to you again later?" Eddie had calmed down a lot from his reaction to the positive seance, also he had now felt extremely comfortable with his conversation with his deceased friend. "Only if you do the seance in this room. Since my death I've remained here to watch over my friend Malachi." Pausing again, as Lloyd looked over towards the bedroom door, just the same as James has been looking over Ronnie. Just as the last few words left Lloyd's mouth, Ronnie instantly jumped back to his feet, then accidentally slamming into the closed door. As Ronnie quickly re-entered his own room, he shut the door behind himself and used his own body to block the door. Hyperventilating, with both arms spread out to each side of himself, Ronnie attempted to look, without moving from the door, into each dark corner, under the bed, and into the closet for any sign of his late friend James. Eddie, himself, had jumped at the sound of the loud thump on the door. Seconds later he heard the padding of Ronnie's feet heading down the hall and then the sound of Ronnie's bedroom door slamming shut. With this thud against the door, Malachi had suddenly turned over in his sleep. "Eddie," Lloyd spoke up one last time, "you've got to realize that not only do people not believe in vampires, but also most don't believe in ghosts either. Take caution when you perform a seance. Also, use your abilities to perform seances as a tool, not for play." "I'll do that, Lloyd. I promise," Eddie responded, and then suddenly the holographic face of Lloyd, along with his voice, vanished into thin air. "Lloyd, where are you?" Eddie called out. Moments later, without receiving a response, Eddie blew out each one of the candles, picked the thumbtacks out of the floor, then picked up the white string that had formed the six-pointed star. After packing his stuff back into his duffel bag, Eddie opened up the bedroom door, then headed down to Ronnie's room. "Ronnie, please open up your door, I need to talk to you," Eddie announced after he quickly found that Ronnie's door was blocked. "Not if Lloyd is with you. If he's with why? Ronnie, Lloyd's not here. He is gone for now. Please open your door so that I can speak with you," Eddie persisted. "But Lloyd just said that him and James are, and always have been here. I don't want to see or hear them. I'm scared of ghosts. Ronnie, please let me in. Lloyd nor James are gonna bother you. I promise you," Eddie continued to beg, and then seconds later the bedroom door slowly opened with Ronnie standing in its place with a look of fear in his face. "See? It's only me, Ronnie. You can trust me," Eddie said as he stepped into the room. "Come on. Sit on your bed with me so that we can talk for a while." "What were you and Lloyd doing, Eddie?" Ronnie asked as he climbed onto the bed and sat next to his brother's friend. "Also, why has James been staying in my bedroom? Or Lloyd and Malachi's for that matter? We didn't do anything to them intentionally." "Ronnie, Lloyd and James both know that what happened was not done intentionally. They both stay here because this is where they died." Then, after putting his arm over Ronnie's shoulder and then pulling him close to himself, "Also, I think that another reason that they stay here is because they still consider you and Malachi to be their best friends." "I miss James. He was my best friend," Ronnie said as he allowed himself to relax against Eddie's side. "I know he was." Now, holding Ronnie in both arms, Ronnie began to quietly cry as his memory had taken him back to different events that involved James and himself. "Ronnie, how about you tell me what happened when James had died? This might make you feel better." "We were just horseplaying here on my bed. I pushed him off of the edge of the mattress. Before he hit the floor he hit that bar." As Ronnie proceeded to repeat the last events of James' life, he pointed to the angle bar of the frame. "The corner of it is real sharp. He landed on it and cut himself real bad. I began to harvest his blood," Eddie interrupted. "Yeah. I didn't mean any harm to him. In fact, that was the first time that I had ever harvested. I miss James so much." Ronnie closed his eyes as he began to quietly cry in Eddie's arms. Ronnie's last memories with James were now nearly 3 years old. Now, at the age of 8, Ronnie had more than less confided in his only brother as a replacement to his friend. Eddie continued to hold Ronnie for about another 10 minutes before he had began to relax. Eddie had realized that the young child had held a large level of guilt against himself in the loss of James. Now, perhaps for the first time since the death, was allowing his feelings of pain to show. Eddie had now, for the first time, felt a personal closeness to his best friend's little brother. It wasn't long before Karina had woken up and had gone out to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. With the sound of dishes being moved around in the kitchen, Ronnie raised his head up off of Eddie's lap where both of them had began to doze off. Honestly, they did. Karina was still wearing her nightgown as she prepared French toast and sausage on the stovetop. Then, as she heard Ronnie's bedroom door open, she turned just in time to see both Eddie and Ronnie exiting the room. "Well, good morning guys. Now Ronnie, you weren't keeping Nicole, Malachi, and Eddie awake were ya?" "Actually Mrs. Declue," Eddie began to answer for Ronnie. "Ronnie had some problems sleeping and so I laid down with him." At this Eddie winked at Ronnie from across the opposite side of the table as they took their seats. Moments later Malachi and Nicole had also came out into the kitchen.